Is Ethan Kolb, and for my literature review, I wanted to talk about the impacts of socially contingent gender roles on perception. As we all know, recent cultural trends have taught us the socially contingent nature of gender. However, for the most part, gender has a huge impact on our lives. For example, it has been shown that there is a positive relationship between interpersonal violence against women and economic, political, and reproductive health inequality. And when it comes to gender, bias that exists at the societal scale has implicit perceptual effects that occur at the psychological scale, and gender has shown to be perceived in hundreds of milliseconds after the perception of an individual. So for this literature review, I tried to make sure to pay attention to perceptual literature and brainwave literature. For example, I looked at EEG studies, I looked at eye tracking, and mouse tracking. When it comes to gender recognition, the recognition of male and female gender categories are relatively automatic, and perception of gender occurs roughly 130 milliseconds after participants perceive stereotypically gendered faces. Of all social categories, participants had the most confidence in their ability to distinguish gender compared to other social categories, such as race, sexual orientation, with a high average of around 96% accuracy. On average, participants perceive gender correctly around 96% of the time. And using mouse tracking, the more stereotypically masculine and feminine faces show more straight and faster velocity cursor movement compared to more gender-ambiguous faces. As you can see in this figure here, gender-ambiguous faces showed more deviance from a more straight trajectory from the stimulus. As you can see, the more gray dots here represent the gender ambiguity, and the black dots here show the more gender stereotypical. Stimulus with gender-ambiguous faces have shown to take longer times to process and produce larger brain waves when being perceived. As you can see here on the second figure I have here, gray line here represents gender ambiguity. When men and women are shown together with gendered tools, such as a ladle or a wrench, women that are shown with a wrench and men that are shown with a ladle produce larger N400 waves. Tools that are societally associated with men that are seen with women show higher brainwave, implying that it takes more energy to perceive gender incongruent stimulus. And if we take an intersectional approach to this analysis, when given gender ambiguous faces, black gender ambiguous faces were more likely to be judged as male, while ambiguous Asian faces were more likely to be perceived as female. So that implies that when gender is more ambiguous and unknown, we will oftentimes take info from other social categories, stereotypes and all. It would be valuable to take more intersectional identities, such as race and class, into account when finding a sample population. For a majority of these tests, the tests that were done in America, most of the participants were white, and so I think it would be valuable for, and none of the articles that were reviewed for this literature review had participants that were gender ambiguous. So people who self-identify as genderqueer or non-binary I could not find any literature review that expressed that participants, that any of their participants were non-binary. So I think that their perspective would be very valuable in understanding the perception of gender as a whole. So yeah, thank you for listening to my literature review.